Hello, this is Olga Lynn Jolly from ojolly.net and craftingfashion.com. I'm going to talk about taming bulky seam allowances on sweater knits. When I say sweater knits, I'm not thinking about the fabrics simply labeled sweater knits. I'm thinking about the comfy, cozy, full of body sweater knits that remind you of sweaters. Here's a sweater I made. It's stretchy, the fabric is textured, but the seam allowance doesn't really stand out except for the stitch pattern. I used a basic 3-thread overlock to finish this one. The serger cuts the seam allowance down to a narrow 3/8 of an inch. The threads basically squish the seam allowance down, so it's not bulky on the other side. On the inside of this cardigan, I have a stretchy Hong Kong finish for the seam allowance. It's basically like a regular Hong Kong finish binding, except that I used a stretchy mesh and I used zigzag stitches. And here's what's keeping it nice and flat. Top stitching. The fabric is so squishy you can barely see it on the right side, but here it is. The seam on this Aran pullover is basically invisible. But don't tell anyone what the inside looks like. What I did was I made the seam, steamed the seam allowances open, and then top stitched on either side of the seam. I then simply trimmed the seam allowances back. The next method was used by a customer who purchased some of my fabrics, and she was nice enough to share it with me. The seam is sewn together, and each edge is overlocked. I've steamed the seam allowances open, and I want to keep them open. My customer sewed the seam allowance down with a catch stitch. I'm using a catch stitch with self yarn, harvested from the fabric itself. Either one will work. I'm planning a cardigan with the fabric pieces you see in the corner. Here's my sample. The seam is flat and stretchy, and the stitches are nearly invisible. Come back to see the finished cardigan. Bye.